Today's topic will include themes of grooming and sexual abuse, which some listeners may find disturbing or triggering. We encourage all listeners to prioritize their own mental health and well-being, and to only engage with this content if you feel you are able. Dissonant dialogues sometimes means difficult dialogues, and this topic may be our most difficult so far. So if you won't be joining us today, we see you, we love you, and feel free to check out our other episodes. Most importantly, dissonant dialogues are never disrespectful. We both strive to create a safe community of classical musicians and the people who love them, to talk about the uncomfortable realities of the music world. Please keep in mind that the stories you hear today are a fraction of a lived experience, and that no one is owed every detail of another individual's trauma. We ask that you avoid speculation about any undisclosed identities or making assumptions about what actions may or may not have been taken in the aftermath of the abuse. Most importantly, victim blaming, harassment, objectification, trolling, or shaming will not ever be tolerated on our platforms. This is for both our safety and the safety of our audience. Please do not hesitate to report inappropriate comments or to bring them to my attention. Specifically to my attention on Instagram, I am at undeadmezzo, Mezzo, just so that there is one less psychological burden that Emily has to deal with, and we will remove them as quickly as possible.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dissonant Dialogues. I am Emily, and I am here with Claire. How are you doing today, Claire?
I'm doing well, all things considered. How are you?
Yeah, man. Well, we'll just find out in a few minutes. I'm not doing the greatest. I mean, I guess in general, my life's been going pretty well over the past couple of weeks. Been doing a lot of new stuff and pushing myself, a lot of new musical experiences in life. But today is definitely going to be a difficult day. One, we should be excited because this is our final episode of season 1. We've made it to the end of season 1, which is awesome. We were able to invite on some really cool guests for episode 6 and 7. So if you haven't listened to those already, highly recommend. Episode 6 is more tailored to like the music education side of things.
Episode 7, I had on another opera singer, so it was a little bit more, singer focused, but we talked about disability, barriers to accessibility for disabled performers in the classical music world, and it was a really, really good emotional conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm so looking forward to seeing it too. And maybe in season 2, we'll see. I mean, I think it's cool how we both brought on our own guests and our own topics.
Yeah.
We can even like collab entirely and have a 3-person thing. So we'll see how that goes.
Absolutely.
This episode is a very significant episode. We are going to be talking about grooming, which is something that happens a lot in conservatory and in the classical music world in general. Personally, I will be talking about what happened to me in conservatory. This particular, what we're going to be talking about in grooming, occurred to me during my freshman year and sophomore year, the grooming that occurred during those years. So I was groomed over an entirety of 2 years and later on sexually assaulted by a professor. And so these scenarios of grooming are from that story, what eventually did lead into sexual assault. But again, we're just talking about basically the first year or so of grooming and what exactly grooming looks like and what that meant. So to clarify, before we begin anything, I have not named this professor who have done these things, and I'm not naming the school either. There's no reason really to name either of these. This is not about him. It's not about anything towards him or towards the school. This episode is about me, solely about me. So I'm sharing my experiences to have it live somewhere other than my head, and also to be able to help others, because a lot of people, the more I speak out about this, like don't understand what grooming is, what leads into sexual assault majority of the times. So, and I'd like to clarify too that in this episode, I don't talk about every single tiny little thing that happened throughout that dynamic with the professor. One, nobody can remember everything. That's impossible, especially one with PTSD. Brain fog is really intense, but so are flashbacks. So I'm talking about particular things that I think will help educate people on grooming that have occurred. And 2, if I talked about every little teeny tiny thing, if I had a magical brain that remembered absolutely everything, that would be a ridiculously long episode. So just to clarify, I'm talking about certain elements of grooming that I think will help educate people that have happened to me in this dynamic. And the purpose of sharing my story is to bring awareness to psychological grooming, which Claire will talk about in a second, which involves only some of these early interactions that occurred with this professor during the time in my life. Like it did turn into sexual assault, but this is what kind of prepared me for the assaults that were to come.
When it comes to sexual abuse and everything that goes into that, there are legal definitions, but we all know legal definitions are not comprehensive, and that laws are constantly being changed and updating as our technology and as our culture is changing and as new needs arise. And sometimes those things do not keep in step with each other. While every state, every jurisdiction has their own definition of what grooming constitutes criminal grooming, for the purpose of today's conversation, we are talking about the psychological definition of grooming. Obviously, there is overlap, but in some areas, you can only prosecute someone for grooming if they groom a minor. But just for the sake of definition that would be used in a therapeutic setting, grooming is any behavior that seeks to condition and brainwash a person, isolate them, and then prepare them over a long, extended period of time by pushing their boundaries bit by bit in order to prepare them for physical sexual abuse. The grooming itself is oftentimes extremely traumatic, despite the fact that our laws may not understand that this can happen to anyone at any age. It is important to understand that if you or someone you love has experienced these behaviors at any age, at any stage of your life, you are valid. We hear you, we support you, you are not alone. And whether or not the law is on your side and has catch-up work to do, your experiences are traumatic and they deserve to be processed safely so you can recover.
Also, I'd like to clarify that not everything I say is going to be in perfect order. Again, I don't have that kind of memory. I don't think anybody does, but generally it is in a chronological order. Everything is laid out pretty well in terms of order that it has happened. This is a really great time to do this episode. I feel like I am ready to talk more about these things that have happened to me. Sometimes the psychological grooming can be just as intense or even worse than sexual assault. And so it has definitely taken a toll on me. These are very difficult things to talk about. But we are filming this right now on July 2nd of 2024, and it has almost been a full year since I spoke out and reported this professor, which was July 25th. It's a day I will not forget. I used to be in this mindset, like back then, I was thinking, I want everybody to know what he did. And I was coming from this place of just anger and wanting rightful justice. But since it's been a year and all the work that I've done, now I'm at this place where I want everybody to know what happened to me. I want to be the story of somebody seeing, look at all these horrible things that happened to me because they're very horrific. And I'm still here. So you can still be here too. Because those people that inspired me, that have had similar things happen to them that I was learning about before I'd spoken out, they are people that helped keep me going too. And I want to be an example. You can still do wonderful things in life and you can still keep going despite these things happening. And then, of course, number one reason I'm speaking about this because I want to help prevent it from happening again to anybody from anybody. Before we get into more of my story, I want to talk about the 7 stages that exist of psychological and sexual grooming. The very first stage is the perpetrator identifies a victim. It's a very calculated choice. Victim is usually young and naive and vulnerable. Then gaining trust with the victim, taking interest in the person, listening to their problems, offering extra help and guidance, communications outside of the regular environment. 3 is becoming important to the victim, becoming the role of a therapist and a friend and listening and demanding information about detailed and deeply personal experiences and trauma, becoming the main and only support system. 4 is isolation. So isolating the victim away from their friends and their family through many calculated ways. 5 is creating secrecy. So this can be done through threats. This can be done through force, emotional abuse. And 6 goes on to sexualizing the relationship. So usually starts off small, just a little touch, a joke, and eventually grows from there so that it's not seen as out of the blue. I like to refer to grooming as preparing you for sexual assault as related to the frog in boiling water scenario. So if you put a frog in boiling water, it's going to jump out right away because like, I don't want to die in the boiling water. But if you put a frog in just like lukewarm water and you slowly start cranking up the temperature, the frog will stay there and boil to death. That's what grooming is. It prepares you for sexual assault, like for the frog death. And then 7 finally is controlling the relationship. keeping things secret, not allowing the victim to set any boundaries, using threats and power against the victim, and keeping them in this dynamic. Let's start with how I met this professor. And for this episode, I'm planning to just say the professor, because for the longest time that I talked about this professor in therapy, he'd prepared me and made sure I wouldn't say his name in therapy. So it was always the professor. So I'm going to refer to him just as the professor. My first year of college was unfortunately 2020, which was the pandemic year. So my entire first year of college was all online, all through Zoom from my childhood bedroom. I met the professor online through Zoom, and we had quite a few Zooms that were alone, just both of us. I was very interested in music theory. I was 17 at this time, very excited to get into music school, like highly passionate about music. I had always been obsessed with music theory. We never had a music theory class in my high school, but my teachers would always give me extra music theory packets because they just knew I loved it. I've been obsessed with Shostakovich since senior year in high school. And it just so happened that this professor taught majority of the music theory classes and also had done a lot of Shostakovich research. So right away when I met him, I was starstruck, like, oh my gosh, like, you know so much about these topics that I really love. This is awesome. There are 4 levels of music theory that are in our conservatory like curriculum. So I had him online for my first semester for level 1 and my second semester online for level 2. He was the kind of professor that was like, seemed to go above and beyond for his students. He was the only professor I knew at this incredibly isolating time that would log in 10 minutes early to the Zoom meetings and invite us all to come in so we could just talk. And I actually met my 3 best friends that way during that year. And at the time during these classes, we were all 17 and older. So it would consist of baseball jokes, dad jokes, music jokes, which eventually he turned into alcohol jokes. And I didn't think anything too weird of it at the time. There were some older students that were in like their upper 20s that didn't tell me until later on that they were like, why is he making jokes about this to people that are like way under 21? I talked with him quite a bit for advice on an overuse injury I was developing, and then I had to have surgery on it, which was my radial tunnel syndrome. My intense struggle with oral skills, if you know, you know, I was not a natural when it came to oral skills. He helped me one-on-one a lot. And many times when we were on Zoom one-on-one, he would talk to me about other life stuff. He'd want to know more about my personal life. Sometimes his kids would pop on too. He'd invite them to come on and talk to me. His wife had even popped on before, and I talked with her a little bit. So I became very close with him throughout that freshman year, and quite literally his family. At the end of that semester of my freshman year, I started a music theory podcast with one of the best friends I mentioned that I had met through the 10 minutes of early Zoom. So we actually did an episode with the professor as well, had him on. I also asked him for help on oral skills research that I was doing. He was one of my multiple advisors. And I also pitched in with some other students to make this virtual funny class moments video compilation with him, because he would always have like these iconic quotes, we would say, like funny stuff he did during class. So we put that together. We all bought him a music theory poster, and it seemed great. He was my favorite professor. Seemed like a really great professor, great connection to have, great for possible letter of recommendation. He knew my work really well because we worked closely on my oral skills work and my research project. Didn't seem weird at all. The majority of this episode is going to be talking about sophomore year, which I think is really when the grooming began, although I guess you can already see, why is he talking about alcohol? That's a lot of individual Zoom meetings with him and I. Basically getting into my life at the time, it was not an easy time. I'm just getting out of a pandemic. I was still very young. It was my first time living alone in a really big city, right smack in the middle of the city, not the suburbs. I had no roommates. I was completely by myself. My dorm was on the 25th floor. I'm afraid of heights, so I was not getting much sleep. I was pursuing 2 majors at the same time, a double degree that was fit into 5 years, which was a very, very intense schedule, still while working part-time. Within the first week of living at school, my mom, boom, diagnosed with cancer, very intense cancer. They told her if she would have waited another day, she wouldn't have survived. Chaos happening in my life. I was learning like how to grocery shop in this new area of living in the city, how to manage life and work. Sophomore year was like what I call freshman year 2.0, because it really did feel like freshman year. There were so many elements of college that I didn't get to experience until sophomore year. I told all of my professors about my mom. I wanted to make sure that they were aware of what was going on. And I wanted to make it clear, look, this is happening. I'm still continuing my degree. I'd waited a year. My mom had no interest in me dropping out of college. And I just wanted to let them know, if I need extra time, is this okay? And they were all great with it. But the professor took a very special interest in this and started offering his morning therapy sessions, is what he would call it, in his office. And who else did I really have to talk to at the time? Yeah, I did have those 3 best friends that I had made through Zoom. That was all I had. I couldn't really get close to anybody on Zoom. There was no walking through the halls freshman year. And one of those 3 best friends, she was a great friend, and I didn't want to like lose her. I was thinking if I talked about my mom that she wouldn't want to hang out with me. So I'm like, okay, well, talk to the professor about it more in detail, I guess. I would never been in therapy before. So I'm like, it's like a morning therapy session. And he's an adult, so he's a great person to talk to for advice. I had confided in him that I'm having trouble making friends. I'm so busy with the double degree and all the chaos I had just mentioned in my life. How do I make friends in college? This is what I've been working for. And right away, he's like, oh, okay, well, the lounge that's right outside my office, go there in the mornings and sit outside in the lounge outside my office and do your homework there instead of doing your homework in your dorm where you're alone, because a lot of people are sitting out in that lounge and you'll certainly make friends from there. People will talk to you and stuff. So I was like, cool, awesome, thank you. Whenever I had questions about class stuff, because I was in his class for the 3rd level of the 4 of music theory, he asked me to come for help in the mornings because students come into his office during office hours. I don't know how that works. So
Wait, you are students?
yes. And I know, yeah, we've talked about that before too. And he was just saying, oh yeah, if you need like help with any of your assignments, like really like intent, because I know you struggled last year, if you really need help, like, and you want to talk about anything, referring to my mom or anything happening, like, you come in the morning. I'm here from 6 a.m. to 7:45. I teach at 8, so come in the morning, but my students usually come in at office hours. And I was like, okay.
So he's
like
already isolated you and separated you and set you apart. You're not the students. You're the person who needs to be there alone.
Yes. And I did not see that at the time too. I'm just like, okay, he really cares. Okay, cool. And important to mention that at this time, 6 a.m. to 7:45 a.m., the halls are pretty empty. Not a lot of people are there. Yeah, normal people are. I'd always been an early bird, so I was like, okay, whatever. I'm up at like 5 a.m. each day, so cool, whatever. During class, I didn't think it was strange that while we were doing our work and he was walking around, he would flick my pencil. So, make me draw a line on my music and I was writing. I'd give him a look. He would just take my pencil while I was writing and like go and put it in his pocket and like walk away. And sometimes he wouldn't even give me my pencil back unless I tried to grab it from him, whether it was in his shirt pocket or his pants pocket. He would like pull on my braid that's in my hair, saying, I just can't help myself. The biggest thing that I remember feeling really, really uncomfortable that I could not justify was when I was sitting in his office and we were at the little table that he had. So his chair was here, my chair was here. He'd always like go to scoot his chair in and bump his knees like hard against mine. It wasn't like a little bump. He didn't ever apologize. He'd like put himself up so his knees were right on mine. And I would wear holy jeans a lot. I thought they were cute. That was like the trend at the time. So I had jeans with like the little holes in them. And immediately he'd start cracking like jokes. He was Catholic as well, which we'll get into. So he'd be like, oh, you wear those jeans to church on Sunday because they're holy? Why would you wear jeans with holes in them? What's the point of that? And while I'm like talking,
we've all heard that before. Get new material.
Yeah. And while I'm talking, he's just like, well, that's so weird. And would take his finger, stick them in the holes in my jeans and like play with it. The holes were on my thighs. That's where he was touching. And I remember that feeling really uncomfortable. And it had to have shown in my face. If I would get a question wrong or say something wrong in his office as we were talking through something, taking a pencil and like hitting my thigh with the pencil. And, I could see not like he's like bad, but joking, right? He's doing this in a joking manner is how he's trying to portray it, but it's still in that exact area. Eventually, he got access to my phone number with this grueling schedule that I had. It was a few weeks into the school year, I believe, and I had a weird blackout. I guess I fainted. I don't know. It was very weird. From not, I don't know if it just wasn't eating healthy, wasn't eating enough, crazy busy college student life. I was trying to adjust to it with the extreme busyness, and I was really freaked out. I missed a class too, which I felt really bad about. And I was like out of it for like hours. And then when I came to, I think it was like 7 p.m. I remember like looking at the clock and I was like terrified. I'm like, what just happened? Am I sick? Is something wrong? Like what's going on? Couldn't go to my mother for advice. She was in the hospital and on chemo and did not know what was going on. So naturally, I went to him over email and I explained what had happened. He responded back and he asked for my number. And I was like, oh God, this must be serious. Something's seriously wrong with me. And so I sent my number and he called me and he started yelling, which was terrifying. I was not expecting that. He yelled for probably like 20 minutes over the phone and he blamed me for not taking care of myself. He ended up like demanding that I miss classes the next day, saying it wouldn't be safe or healthy for me to go to school. And he drove to school. That was the next night to bring me like apples, peanut butter, jelly bread, melatonin. I was like, wow, he's really going out of his way. And that's what he said too. Like, I'm getting this stuff for you because I want to make sure that you're okay and you're going to eat this stuff and you're going to feel better and take care of yourself. He had told me too that very night that the phone call happened, he wanted to bring me that stuff that night, but he was very upset because his wife wouldn't let him. Through that, getting my number, you would think it just happened for that phone call, but then he started checking in on me, sending silly emojis and texts just on the notion of, I just want to make sure you're okay. Are you okay? Are you eating better? How are you feeling? And I'm like, okay, he's just checking. We didn't have a school nurse. And he recommended that I have a Zoom call with his wife to talk about grocery shopping because he was like, well, I don't really do any of that stuff. My wife does that. She can help you like figure out good places in the area to go to. I didn't have a car down there. And the Zoom call with his wife was very nice. Like I said, I'd kind of already met her freshman year, but now I really officially got to meet her one-on-one. I found out that he was sitting on the other side of the computer the whole time. I did not know he was hearing everything that we were talking about, but he was right there. She had recommended like a white noise app to help me sleep. She talked about Instacart. I'd never heard of that. So she kind of reminded me of him, but she was just like stepping in basically of that role. It's like, well, your mom's sick. I'm here. Here you go. This is what you need to look into. And she shared her phone number with me for any questions that I might have about anything we talked about. So now I had his number, he had my number, and I had her number and she had my number. This eventually morphed into him requesting me to do personal projects, is what he would call it. So some of the things he had me do was map out my schedule for the week and send it to him. Now he had access to everything I was doing during the week. He asked me to go around the general area of my school and to take pictures of myself in front of grocery stores to prove that I had found places like his wife had asked me to do. He said he wouldn't believe me unless I took pictures in front of them with me in it.
Cool.
He would have me take pictures of my food at dinner to prove I was eating and what I was eating. He would yell and get very angry if I had anything that was like not healthy. Sometimes he wouldn't even talk to me because he'd be so upset about it. I remember walking down the hallway with him. We're heading to his office because I had some questions on an assignment. And there was a girl in the hallway that was in my studio. And she was very sweet, very kind. And she saw us. And the professor had actually stopped her and asked her to try to convince me to take this extra music theory course that was going to be offered after I got my required 4 classes out of the way. And he's like, hey, you got to convince her to take this. It's called Counterpoint. Like, you got to get her to take Counterpoint. Tell her how amazing it was. And so she was talking about it. And then she's like, oh, yeah, well, like, I know Emily. She's Instagram famous. You should follow her. And was like joking around because I think I had like 15,000 followers at the time, which was pretty cool. I'd had my account for a long time. And once we'd walked back to his office, I explained what exactly that was. I'm like, oh, yeah, I have this account. I post all this music stuff. It's all related to music. It's really cool. He was like kind of bringing up like, well, you haven't friend requested me on Facebook. I see you did with these 2 other professors. But I never friend requested this professor because I just kind of like knew him already. Like with the other professor, it was kind of just to get to know them better. But this one, like he was actively teaching my classes at the time. And I didn't really feel comfortable with having him as a teacher. And while he is currently my teacher, friend requesting him. Like if it was a summer between classes, that feels different to me. But that's why I'd never done it. I had asked him then, I was like, well, for our music theory podcast, we do have a podcast Instagram page. You should make an Instagram account and follow that page so you can follow along with music theory stuff. We'd love to get like your perspective. He ended up making an Instagram account and he followed both pages. He said he would follow the music theory podcast page if I friend requested him on Facebook. It wasn't like, you have to do this, right? That would be like a red flag. He knew how to do it. He was like, well, you got to do this. And he was joking around. All right, like you friend request me on Facebook, then I'll support your page. And I saw that he followed my personal page. If you know my Instagram, you know I post a lot of stuff on there. So you do get to know me somewhat intimately on my Instagram.
looking back at the time, you didn't find all of this enmeshment and entanglement to be a red flag. You just thought he was kind, because I think that's something people will wonder. We've obviously discussed that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I did not. And I think that was because there were never many boundaries between me and teachers before, specifically music teachers. When I was in junior high, there was a music teacher that taught in a school and came over to my house once and like got to know my parents, and she saw my bedroom with all my music stuff in it, and I, you know, that was just normal to me. And like now I guess being like a teacher myself, I think that's kind of strange, but like she did come over and she's been fine, you know, she's not done anything weird. And we went to a concert together to see a two cellos group play. Other like teachers before, my private teachers, I've always had their cell phone numbers. I've always texted them with questions, sent them videos. I've always been very, very close with my music teachers. So I'm like, well, it's a music theory teacher. I'm like, yeah, we're going to be close. So that's what the dynamic is like with music teachers. It's much closer than say a math teacher or science teacher, you know?
Yeah, I guess in my experience, it was always coaches were closer, but your professors still had that like that distance, because yeah, it's very normal to have your instrument teacher's phone number and to send them videos and stuff. There is a level of intimacy in learning music, but I guess it's hard to know when you're on your own for the first time, like what adulthood is supposed to look like.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think my body and my mind eventually started to tell me something is wrong. We had, not this podcast, the music theory podcast I was doing, we had a podcast recording the night before this happened. And I really wasn't feeling well before we recorded, and I almost canceled. I was almost like, oh, I can't do it, but we were going to have a guest and stuff. So I kind of pushed through and I recorded it, and it ended up being a really great episode. I had went to the professor the following day in the morning, and I told him about this music theory episode that we did, and I explained what happened. And as soon as I said that, oh, I almost didn't go because I wasn't feeling great, but then I went and it was wonderful, he was mad. First, he's like, well, you're not taking care of yourself. Like, you need to go to the cafeteria, like go get a milk carton, go drink some milk. That's good for you. And I'm like, I don't really drink milk, for one. And two, like I don't think they like even have like milk cartons down there, because that was specifically what he said, it was the milk carton. And I'm like, there's not milk cartons there. And he's like, oh, come on, you're telling me a cafeteria doesn't have milk cartons? And I'm like, I swear, like I live there. Like there are no milk cartons. And I'm like, do you live there? And you know, he was like convinced. He's like, all right, well, you have to get up with me. We have to go to the cafeteria right now. And I'm showing you where the milk cartons are. And I remember sitting in the chair in his office, and I was like, come on, I just want to come in here for a second, let you know how the podcast episode went. And then I need to go practice because I got stuff to do. And that was where he had threatened to report me as a student of concern if I didn't go with him. And I think this is what he had threatened over the phone too when he first got my number and was yelling at me. He told me that you can report a student of concern, and that if he thinks I'm concerned, I'm not taking care of myself, they can take me off for a semester and then reassess if I'm fit to continue my degree or not. And he said all he had to do was report me, and immediately I would be out, and then I'd be back home.
Which is
I did not want to go back.
Massive exaggeration of how that actually works.
Yeah. And I did not want to go back home, especially with the chaos that was happening at home. So I went down with him to the cafeteria. There were no milk cartons, and it was kind of funny watching him be like looking for the milk cartons, because I'm like, I told you. And then he's like, oh, here, see, there's the milk. And the milk was a part of the coffee machine. So I did not see it. I don't really drink coffee. So then we went back to his office, a very awkward walk back. And he threatened to file the report against me and said that, yeah, I would be off for a semester and I could even be expelled from the school because I wasn't ready to be independent. And I was so upset. I was worried I wouldn't be able to continue my degree. I had worked my butt off to make it to conservatory. Didn't have the greatest high school experience, and I was finally like in music school. This is everything I'd worked up to. And now knowing he could take it away, that he was threatening to do that, it felt off. Something felt wrong. And I walked to the practice rooms. I pulled out my Kreutzer book, pulled out my violin. I think I started to play a little bit. And then I just started to cry. And it wasn't like a sad cry. It was a frustrated cry. And finally I was shaking. I set my stuff down and I like stomped my way through the practice rooms, swooped around into his office. And I don't want to say I yelled. I think I just talked sternly. And I was very like, you don't get to say this stuff to me. You don't get to control me. You have no idea what my home life is like and what you would do to me if you sent me back there. He immediately picked up on that. It's like, you don't even know me. You don't know anything about me. Leave me alone. And he tried to pull me into his office because at that time it wasn't super early, but it was still kind of early. And I don't remember really seeing a bunch of people around there at the time, but maybe there were some people there, and he was trying to grab my arm and to pull me into his office. And I'm like, no, no. I just kept saying no. I'm like, you're not bringing me in here. I'm like, no. And I said whatever. And then I walked away. I went in the practice rooms. And then, of course, when I have to go to his class in like half an hour, that I practiced, and it kind of cooled me down. And then once I walked out of the practice rooms to go to the classroom, right when I turned the corner, he was walking right out of his office, and then he's just like looking away from me. And I started to feel really bad. And I was like, I am going to screw my reputation up. Like, this professor, he knows everything about me. He could write the best letter of recommendation. He knows about my work ethic in classes. He knows a lot about my violin ability by following me online, and he sees all my videos. Like, he is the one to write me this letter of recommendation. Like, I'm screwing this up. Let me apologize and let me just get this behind us. I went to his class, and once he came in before class started, I asked to talk to him in the hallway, and I apologized. And I'm like, I'm really sorry that I yelled at you like that. You were just getting me really upset. Like, I don't want to go home. I've worked hard to be here, and I want you to understand that. And afterwards, he just said I'd said stuff that had concerned him, and he wanted me to come back to his office after class to talk. And he was asking a lot about my home life and my family life and what things were like for me. And he was like, well, I'm like a mandatory reporter if you're under 20.
It's not true. He was lying about how all of this works. You stood up for yourself, and he extracted the kernel of vulnerability out of that and used it against you immediately.
Yeah. So yeah, he said if I was under 21, anything I told him that he would be a mandatory reporter. It was like, all right, well, not telling you anything anyway, so all right. And then things like seemed to be okay then. So I think it's important to mention as we're going along some of the good deeds that he had done to hold against me. And I'd like to mention way more happened junior year, and that is where the sexual assaults actually took place. But these are some of the things that had already happened sophomore year. I'm in his class, like his actual class. I'm signed up for it for theory level 3, but he had offered for me to be in his Schenkerian analysis class, which was a graduate level class. And I wasn't technically signed up for it. I was just sitting in on it, and he was giving me extra help with it because it was a graduate level class, but I was in love with music theory. So I was so excited to sit in on it. And he instructed me, like, you do not tell anybody about this, otherwise I could get in serious trouble. He wanted me to sit kind of by myself in the class and not really make my presence too much known. Just don't make it a big thing. Don't tell other professors. Like, I could get in trouble for like wasting the school out on money, like, because you should be signed up for it technically. Risking himself is what he said for me. So I had that on me. He'd helped me when I was sick, I guess, yelled at me over the phone, but he did bring me food. On Halloween, I got really sick. I was like throwing up. I was sick. I was not okay. And he was texting me and making sure I was okay. He gave me this ginormous bag of candy. So there was that.
But then he yells at you for not eating healthy.
Yeah. See, when we talk about it now, it's like things start to like click. But yeah. And he did though. He did the bag of candy when I was like, oh my God, look at my indent that I made in it. And he would get mad. And he's like, you have to learn how to ration it. It's like, but I'm like, he's just being a parent, right? Like, that's what he seems like. So I'm like, that's what my parents would say. Okay.
Which is not who he should be to you.
He tried to get me a boyfriend, which we'll get into. Yeah, he took me to the vending machines in our school. He went and bought me a candy. He's like, anything you want, like, I'll give to you. So you have some energy before rehearsal. And so here I am thinking, wow, this professor is spending money on me, spending time on me, taking a risk by letting me be in this class. Like, oh yeah, he genuinely cares about me. And like, he's doing a lot for me. And when you have somebody that's doing a lot for you, there's always that notion of like, I owe them something. Like, they're really, really doing a lot. And especially in my life, I felt like I was on my own except this professor. And so far, our conversations had mostly been about music, classwork, my home mess with my mom. But eventually, those conversations had shifted, and he was responsible for the conversation shift. I had been offered an opportunity to play the entire Mendelssohn violin concerto with a pianist that was learning how to accompany. So, really cool opportunity for a sophomore violinist. And I had told him about it, of course, and I'd also invited him to come as well, and with many other professors. He ended up being the only professor that did come. I had a few friends come too, but he was the only professor that came. So prior to it, when I knew he'd be coming and he was going to bring who also had played violin, he had brought up some stuff of like nerves, like playing an entire concerto. I'd never done that before. And he's like, you should try drinking before you go on stage. It can really like loosen you up so you won't be as nervous. And I'm like, oh, I actually have never drank alcohol before. Like, I don't really have an interest in it. I don't think I ever want to drink alcohol. At the time, though, I was 19.
I was gonna
No,
ask.
18. I was 18 at the time. Now he's learned I've never drank alcohol before. And he's like, oh my gosh, well, there are all these kinds. You should really try it. It can loosen you up to do like some fun things, you know? And I was
Mm.
like, well, what are you talking about? I had no idea what he was talking about. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you know, it can make you like hop into bed with almost anyone. And I'm like, oh, and that's another time where I'm like, oh God, does he not realize? Because I knew he was Catholic. I'm like, oh, well, you know, I'm Catholic, right? Like I'm waiting until marriage. Like I'm a virgin. And he's like, well, what? Like completely baffled by it. And he's like, well, I'm Catholic. I didn't wait. My wife didn't wait either. And she's like more Catholic than I am. And he goes on this whole spiel, like explaining that God wouldn't create these pleasure areas if we should wait till marriage. He wants us to use them and just saying, like, you need to really reevaluate that. Like, it seems like you've had a really negative Catholic upbringing because that shouldn't be a thing. So now he knows I've never drank alcohol. He knows that I'm naive about that. And he knows that I'm a virgin. With this information, he points outside his door to the lounge. He asks if I liked anybody. When he was trying to like help me make more friends, he'd introduced me to a guy that he had in one of his theory classes. I was a sophomore, this guy was a senior, and he was like a nerd about music theory. So the professor was like, oh, this guy's perfect for you. You guys can be friends. I thought he was very sweet, very cute, very mature. I'm like, well, like, I guess he's pretty cute. Right away, he's like, oh, so yeah, he's a senior and you're a sophomore, so you must like older men. He kind of encouraged us to talk a little bit more. If he'd ever like seen us both in the hallway or one somewhere and one the other, like he would try to bring us together. But as the conversations are shifting, now we have a conversation about Christmas. He knew that I was not celebrating Christmas with my family. My mom was getting her stem cell treatment at that time, so she would not be home for Christmas or for New Year's. And my family, because of that, they're like, well, we're just not celebrating. We're not going to do anything. To me, Christmas is always very special. Yeah, because I'm Catholic, but like, you know, yeah, I guess because I'm Catholic. It has a lot of meaning to me, and it always been very special. And I was really heartbroken when I found that out. And I do remember crying in his office, and I was like, oh my God, we're not celebrating Christmas. I'm like, what am I going to do on Christmas? Like, do I just practice and try to do music theory, try to distract myself? Like, while my mom's in the hospital, he used this time to invite me to go to mass with his family on Christmas Eve and then celebrate with them on Christmas Day. And I was like, oh my God, yeah. Like to me, that was like the best Christmas I could have. I'd always wanted to go to mass on Christmas, but my family, they're not as Catholic as me, and they just didn't really do that. But they were like mega Catholic church. Like, yeah, we go on Christmas Eve, and then yeah, we play with the kids and stuff on Christmas Day. I hadn't gone to church since the pandemic because everything had been shut down. My
Right.
church itself had completely closed after the pandemic as well. So then I was like, oh, the church I've been at my whole life is now closed, but hey, I'm being invited to go to this one. And the day after he had come and he'd seen me perform, he asked me to come to his office, and he pulled the door and he's like, look, we have to have a conversation about this. Do you like me? Do you have feelings for me? And I was like,
Thrown off. Where did that
so
come from?
thrown off. I remember just being in complete shock, and I'm like, I thought he was joking because he's this silly kind of guy. I'm like, what? I think I started laughing. Then he was just so serious. He's like, yeah, do you like me? And I'm like, you're like over 50, almost 60. I'm 18. What are you talking about? And he's like, well, like it's not anything abnormal. You've just kind of like taken interest in me. Like we know each other really well. I just want to make sure before I invite you over for Christmas that you don't have some sort of crush on me or something. And I'm like, I know your
set up
wife.
the whole dynamic.
Yeah. And as I said, like, I know your wife, I know your kids. He's like, well, you know, you are very similar to my wife. She was also a violinist like you. She was and is also obsessed with music theory. She also had difficulty adjusting during her college years. She was also my student. And that's where I'm like, oh, I'm like, what? And he's like, do you know how like far apart we are in age? I'm just like, how far apart you are? And he's like, well, she doesn't like people to know her age, but he told me that they're 10 years apart. And I'm like, oh. He tried to like clarify to me, like we both took interest in each other. I wasn't pursuing her. This was a very like psychological trick that he would play on me for quite a while. This kept coming up. He would always tell me, you must have a crush on me. Sometimes he'd say it in a joking manner. Other times he would get really upset and yelling, and I never really understood. And it got to the point where he'd say it so much. You did this, you did this. Like, so yeah, you have to like me. And brainwashing me into thinking like, do I? And it's very ironic that he was saying this and convincing me of this, because what we'll get into is I was aware at the time that I was gay. I don't really like men though. Like I like women, And so like the way he's saying, no, you like me. I'm like, do I? Like, do I like men? I'm thinking because I was so ashamed. And
did that factor into the crush that you had admitted before on the older guy? Was that a compulsive heteronormativity thing where you were like, I guess he's attractive?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was the ideal attractive man, pretty much. And I felt close with him in terms of like a friendship. He was a lot more respectful and a great friend. So I'm like, okay. I tried to explain to the professor who kept saying, you like me, you like me. I'm like, well, you know, I thought of how to explain how I feel about you to you. I don't really see you as like a gender necessarily. Like I kind of just see you as like a plant. And I started to laugh. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, you know, I guess it made more sense in the moment. I'm like, I don't see you as like a man, you know, like I just don't. Like you're my teacher, you're my professor. Like I don't even see you that way. You're just like, you're a plant, you know, like you're just, you're alive, you're there, but I don't see you that way because you're my professor. He did not like that. And he got really tipped off. He was like, you know, I like to be seen as masculine. Like you don't even see me as a man. He was mad beyond words about that.
Sounds like a you problem, sir.
Going into Christmas then, I did go over there for Christmas Eve. I was very close with his wife. I became much closer with the wife than I was with him eventually. So the mass on Christmas Eve was incredible. It was beautiful. Everybody, like this might sound silly, but everybody sang. You know, when it came time to sing, everybody sang. And at my previous church, only the people of the choir or only the people that went up to speak sang. Otherwise, it was just the piano. And I was very ashamed of my singing voice. The professor knew that because he'd done my sight singing exams, and his wife and his kids and even him had gotten me to sing with them. And just the power you feel, you would know this, Claire, the power you feel when you're singing with a group of people, it's beyond words. Like it just felt so nice to like worship what everybody else believed in, like me, finally being with the people that had similar like religious beliefs as me, because I was never really around that. The homily was incredible. Then we went back to his house for dinner. So he had told me, bring your Christmas pajamas. Like, well, I'll change into them. And like, I was almost in tears. I was like, this is really nice. This is a wonderful Christmas. I thought this would be the worst Christmas ever, given my mom and my family's circumstances, but this is great. I had brought just a couple gifts for them, like kind of like a big family gift, like 2 family gifts for them. And I wasn't expecting to get gifts that day, but they did. There were multiple gifts for me. They were kind of just passing out the gifts, and these were all like with my name on them. It was like a bunch of books. And when I was doing the back and forth thing, because I was not going to be spending the night there, I had drove there. Originally, I was like, I could just take the train because I'll be going back to my dorm and then I'll be coming right back. He was like, no, you're not taking the train. Like, you're definitely not doing that. Not alone. Like, it's not happening. And I'm like, dude, it's like the simplest way. Like, come on, I'm fine. I'm like, don't worry about it. And he got so mad and he was like, Emily, if you take the train and you get raped, that is your fault. That is not on me. And I was like,
crazy thing to say.
I know. I was in so much shock. I'm like laughing now, but I was like, I was just quiet. I didn't even know what to say. And then he started to get like upset with himself. I was like, look, I'm just like, you know, I don't want you to take the train. Like I will drive you to and forth. Like, you drive to my house, you park, then I'll drive you to your dorm. Then I'll pick you up. I'll drive back and pick you back up. And then I'll drive you back for Christmas Day. Okay.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. That's what he decided on. And that's what we did. And I was like, you know, I'm lucky I can celebrate Christmas with the family. So I'm just going to do it. Whatever. Should also mention, this was pandemic time still. Yeah. And during my mom's stem cell, they did not allow any of us to go in. A lot of our communication was like texting and FaceTime. I went back to my dorm, and then when I came back over for Christmas Day, for the first time, I think this was the first time he'd hugged me, was hugging me goodbye. And his family was all about hugs, so it didn't seem weird. And basically over the rest of my winter break then, he texted me almost every single day. And he was just kind of checking in on me and seeing how I was. His wife was too. Almost as much as him, kind of checking in on me.
Do you feel like your experience in Chicago was limited because this thing that 95% of people do in Chicago, which is learn how to take public transit, he has now made you afraid of? So then you were also separated from other peers and other students who are all taking the train every day, and you're afraid to even explore that, not only for your safety, but because of his judgment.
100%. Yeah. Because then I was avoiding the train. I didn't want to take it for anything. Then I wasn't really going anywhere. All I was doing was around my school. For New Year's Eve, I did not have any plans for New Year's, and I didn't really care. And that day he texted me and asked me what I was doing for New Year's Eve, and I explained I didn't really have any plans. And he ended up calling me like just an hour or so later, and he was like, what are you doing? I'm like, sitting in my bed. What? And he's like, do you want to come to mass with us? And I was like, oh, like, sure. He's like, all right, like, how long does it take you to get here? And I mapped it, and he was like, okay, go now. Like, and he was like yelling at me. He was like, yo, you have to hurry. Like, otherwise you're going to be late. You're going to make my wife mad. Like, we got to go. And I was like, okay. So I drove over there really quickly, parallel parked for the very first time. It was really bad, but I did. And then I rushed, and we just like made it in time. Then yeah, he made it a factor to fix my parallel parking job. That wasn't the best. And everybody else then went inside, back to his house after the mass, and he'd gotten in my car with me, and he'd like shown me like how to parallel park. And I remember when he was done and he'd fixed it, I was like, oh, okay, cool, thank you. He reached over and slapped my thigh like as a joke for doing a bad parking job. Mm-hmm. And I remember just like kind of laughing and being like, ow, because it was like a hard slap. And I'm like, he's just being a silly dad sort of thing. Like, it's fine. We went back inside then and stayed till midnight. And once it reached the new year, you know, he shouted like, all right, everybody, like New Year's hugs and kisses. I watched as he kind of went around and like hugged and kissed everyone. And I'm like, okay, yeah, his wife, yeah. His kids, yeah, cute, okay. And then he comes up to me, and I'm just kind of like going through the motions and go to give him a hug. And as I lean in for the hug, he kissed me on the cheek. Like, not just like a like peck kiss, but like I'm talking about a deep kiss, and like squeezed me into him really, really tight. I remember feeling a little uncomfortable. I remember turning when he was done, and I looked at his wife, and his wife was just very casual. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I guess that's okay. Otherwise his wife would have said something. Like, I guess that's normal, you know. They're very different than my family. So yes, their culture is very different than my family's culture. So that's just normal. Going into the second semester of my sophomore year, hugs became a more prominent thing, more physical contact. So he explains like, oh yeah, I hug everybody that's close to me. I call everybody close to me like sweetheart, like family members, like everything, you know, I always like say sweetheart, and I hug everybody. That's just like normal for me. With my mom going through everything she was going through, and the stress of everything I was going through that he was aware of, he started offering these hugs at the end. He's like, let me give you a hug before you leave my office after we talk. And he would like always close the door so nobody could see it, based on perspective was his thing. It's like, I just don't want anything to think anything's weird, like, right, we're just getting a hug. I'm like, okay,
because it is weird.
Yeah, it's like, well, you know, there's like this research that everybody like should have at least 8 hugs a day to like be healthy and happy. And I remember there was some
that's
like
too many
news article.
Touched. Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking. Like, who gets 8 hugs a day? Like, I don't know anybody. But he's like, you're obviously not getting anywhere near the amount that you should. So let me give you a hug and help make you feel better. Like, you need it. Like, you're not okay. And I felt so broken down. And I'm like, okay, I guess so. He used this time to like critique my hugs. And he's like, you're so weird the way you hug. Why, when you hug me, like you lean forward like this, like your legs are away, like your legs and your hips aren't pressed into mine. Like, that's weird. And I'm like, oh. And I was serious. I'm like, oh, is that how people give hugs? I'm trying to think, like, how do I see people give hugs? He would like push my leg, quite literally force my legs into him. He's like, that's how it should be. And I'm like, oh. The hugs eventually went much further. Sometimes it would be like just jokingly poking my stomach. Other times he would like just rub my back like over my clothes, saying that was soothing. Then he said that it's more soothing if he rubs my back under my shirt, that skin to skin contact, like that is more soothing. Eventually it was like lowering his hand from like my upper back to my lower back. And eventually then it went down to my behind, and he would even as a joke be slapping my behind really hard because it hurt, and I would say ow, and like I would pull away. But then eventually his hand went higher again, and it was playing with my bra. Then it was unclipping my bra. This all happened, what I'm talking about right now, over a long period of time. Like, this happened from when the hugs first started all the way through like a year. It took a year for him to get that far. Then that goes into junior year stuff a little bit. When the senior guy and I did separate, I was close with his wife, and I had told her, since we were more like girlfriends at the time, that boy used to give like these really sweet, what I would call bear hugs that made me feel really safe. And I told her like, I love that he does that. And I was telling her like, God, I miss that. And I did not realize that anything I told her was being directly shared with the professor. So that helped perpetuate the thing with the hugs, and he would use that against me. Around February, he starts asking me to go to weekly masses with his family. So I had gone for the 2 holidays, and he was like, well, why don't you start going like weekly with us? We go every single Sunday. So I was seeing him 5 days a week, and now that had turned into 6 days a week around this time. I I
Mhm.
drink out of plastic water bottles. It's how I grew up. We just always drank out of plastic water bottles. And I get where people are like, oh, that's hurting the planet, blah, blah, blah. And he even said to me, he's like, I don't like that you do this. This is weird. You're hurting the planet. It's not normal. You should have like a regular water bottle. And I explained to him, look, for one, this is how I grew up drinking water. Two, like with the chronic conditions I had and stuff, I'm very careful with what I put into my body. And I had a situation with a water bottle before that like grew mold in it. And I didn't actually get sick from it, but like that turned me off. I'm like, nope. When I was younger, punishment was to make me drink soap, like liquid soap. And so that taste of soap like can freak me out now whenever like I smell that. And I've had regular water bottles before, but I had once where my mom went to wash my water bottle and she didn't get all the soap out. And I went to
Yeah.
drink it and there was the soap taste, and immediately that freaked me out and I did not drink water the whole day. I need to make sure I'm drinking enough water and being healthy. If this is the way I'm going to do it right now, this is the way I'm going to do it. I am not going to be responsible for climate change. I think we can name a bunch of other things that are the primary cause. No, I have water bottles. Like I do have them. I'm not ready to use those right now. And nope, he was not taking that. He brought the water bottle there, and I actually faked drinking out of it for a while for him. And I would sneak the plastic one in my backpack so he couldn't see it. And I would drink out when I wasn't around him because I needed to drink my water. And
Yeah.
eventually it was so much of a pain trying to like hide that from him just so he wouldn't get mad, where I just went back to my plastic water bottles. And once he noticed this, yeah, he got pretty upset with me. He'd use it against me later on, saying I wasn't taking his advice, I wasn't listening, and that he would get really mad about it. So at this point, I am in my fourth and final semester of the required music theory. And for this one, this professor was not my professor. It was another professor who was like besties with him. He wouldn't really respond for questions. I went on an individual Zoom with him and I was like, hey, I'm struggling with this. And as soon as I opened the Zoom meeting to talk about what I was having trouble with, he's like, can you suck any more time out of my life? During class in front of everybody, he would yell and point at me for not understanding something whenever I asked a question. And he wouldn't like yell it again and try to explain it in a different way. He would just yell the same thing he explained already louder. So the same way. He only had one way to explain everything. There was one particular thing that I didn't get where he started to degrade my violin skills because of it, that I couldn't be a good violinist if I didn't get one concept. After all of that, I didn't really want to go to that professor for help. So I would sometimes go to the professor that I'm talking about for help. I was still like in his office quite a bit asking questions. As I'm continuing going to church with his family, he pulled me into his office and he was like, look, if you're going to continue going to church with me and my family, I need to know everything about you. You need to tell me about like your family life. You need to tell me about like previous boyfriends and stuff. And I like begged not to, because who wants to talk about that? Okay, who wants to talk about like childhood trauma,
So
abusive
weird.
exes, to your male professor? That's like
so
nowhere
weird.
near my age. But I told him some stuff and I was sobbing. And that's when he then switched from being, well, he was still the abuser, but switched from being the abuser to being the one that would save me from his own abuse. And he would like use napkins because he didn't have tissues in his desk and take them out. And he would like wipe off my makeup and be very gentle about it. He would hug me, rub my back. He would give these like sincere apologies, promise I don't have to talk about it again. There was a time where I didn't even want to look at him because of the stuff he was making me talk about. And I would just kind of like sit in my chair, like looking down with my legs squeezed together. And he pushed my legs apart, crawled between my legs and hugged me that way.
Real soothing.
When you're talking about such upsetting and vulnerable stuff, you feel so vulnerable and so broken that anybody trying to offer care to you seems like good care. And so then, yes, I could continue going to church. He started showing me then how to use the bus for public transportation because he didn't want me to take the train. Eventually, he starts to pressure me to do more things with this senior guy. And I was like, no, I'm like not very like experienced in like that sort of thing. I made some comment too. I was like, well, I've never even tried tampons and like joking around, but to try to like get him to realize like, no, not interested in that, really like started to make me feel bad for I've never tried them before. He's like, this is your body. Like you should know your body. I ended up, I was gonna say borrowing a tampon from my best friend at the time, and not borrowing, taking. She let me have one. I had tried it. Okay, wore it. I don't think I'd ever wear it again. I mean, yes, I can wear one, just wasn't comfortable. And I told him, I'm like, okay, yeah, I tried it, just not my thing, but I tried. There you go. And he had asked if it felt good. I don't remember everything perfectly, but I do feel like this was one of the triggers that became the masturbation talks that he wanted to do.
It's
So
just
I'm
such a 12-year-old boy thing. I'm sorry. I just have such a visceral reaction to any man who's like, oh, does it feel good? Like, I just, okay, sorry, compose myself.
There was a time where we were walking back from class and we passed by one of my music ed advisor's offices. And he was like, oh, I got to tell you a funny story about her. Come back to my office. And so we went to his office. And he's like, oh, you ever seen the Magic Flute opera before? And I'm like, no. And he's like, oh yeah, I went with her and the other theory professor. We all went together and we saw it. And then, you know, some part of the opera, like he's standing there and he's holding his flute like beside him and it's like shadow casted. And I turned and like looked at the other male professor. Is like, oh yeah, like he looks really happy to see her. And he's like, oh yeah. And then your music advisor was like, stop, stop, stop. And he was just laughing about it. And I was like, wait, like, why is it funny? And I'm like, and I thought it was because when she was saying stop, 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 because they were talking during the opera and I'd never been to an opera. And I'm like, oh, you're probably not supposed to like talk during them. And I'm like, oh, because you talked. And he was like, no, like you think about the way he was standing. And I'm like, and then he stood up and he's like, it looks like a penis. And I'm like, oh, okay. And just like laughing, like, oh, okay. Yes, that did feel weird. I remember being there and just being like, but immediately it was justified as this is college. We're supposed to joke about sex adults like this, you know? Yeah, like we're supposed to do that.
Yeah, with your friends, maybe. Not with your professors. Yeah, that's so weird.
Eventually, I had actually spoke up and I was like, you know, I'm in college. My dream in college was to meet like this music theory nerd and that we would just fall in love and get married and everything would be wonderful. And I'm like, well, this guy is nice. Like maybe this could work. And I went to one of his concerts and afterwards I'd never asked a guy out on a date before. I went up to him and I asked him out and he said, yeah. And we exchanged numbers and that was planned. When we went on the date, the professor and his wife separately were texting me both before and after. The wife was mostly like giving me advice because I have IBS. I'm like going out to eat with him, like make sure you order something like this and, you know, wishing me the best. And then after the date, I was so thrilled because we got along so well. And both him and his wife were texting me asking how it went. And it was so much trying to keep up with both of them texting at the same time that eventually I'm like, well, which one do I want to talk to more in my head naturally? And I go to the wife because she's a girl. And so I start talking to her and I kind of just left his questions and I kept talking to the wife. The next day, I found out by the professor that she had showed him all of our private texts, that she'd seen everything that I talked to her personally about. And he was like, oh yeah, like I saw where you wrote this, and kind of giving me like these looks and how embarrassed I was. He's like, I like seeing you embarrassed about this stuff. And I was just like, well, why did she have to tell you? Like that was supposed to be just between her and I, like girl to girl. And he's like, one thing you're going to learn about us is anything you tell one of us will inevitably get to the other. And that was always the thing he kept saying over and over and over. That's why I know it like by memory. It's not healthy. Yeah.
It's a manipulation tactic. Look, there are certain things. I'm married. I understand that like there are certain things where it's like, all right, this is my husband. I don't keep secrets from him. But that doesn't involve violating someone else's privacy. Yes, we're going to discuss things that come up with other people. But even like with you, I'm pretty careful about like checking in with before I bring him into a conversation. Right. And I know like what your boundaries are. So while it's okay to talk about the emotional processing or to play voice memos out loud when he's around, when you're talking about like emotion stuff, if you're sending me a really intimate story with a lot of like physical details, I'm going to keep that private because it doesn't add any value to his life, nor does it strain our relationship in any way for me to keep details about your body or your, you know, physical experiences or sexual abuse experiences to myself.
Right. And I always appreciate that you asked to double check because like, yes, he's your husband, but he's a man too. Tying back to the times that he drove me back from his house to the bus stop, which wasn't necessary. I remember being in his car on the way back from mass and he asked me about the guy, how things were going. He's like, you know, like you have a single dorm. You should invite him up. And I'm thinking, yeah, because I don't have roommates, so we could talk in private. That makes sense. But he starts hinting at it being something more sexual. And I was like, no. And I reminded him, like, I want to wait till marriage. And the way he said this was like, I remember how scared it made me feel. And he's like, well, you really need to reconsider that. Like, no guys are going to wait, especially with you. Like, no one's going to wait.
Especially with you.
Which becomes important later on. I remember going back and feeling so panicked. Like, I'm going to lose this guy that I'm getting along with so well. And I reached out to his wife and I was like, can we keep this between us? And I didn't tell her that he had said it to me. I just said, I'm starting to worry because I feel like there's this pressure, for me to do more with this guy, but I don't want to. I want to wait till marriage. And her response was very great. It was, it's everybody's choice. It's your choice. And she's told me, I guess she didn't know that I already knew this because of her husband telling me, but she's like, I didn't wait, but it's everyone's choice. Like there shouldn't be any pressure from anyone except you. And I'm like, yeah. And I felt so much better about it. He saw those texts from his wife and he referenced them the following day. So my trust for the wife was starting to shatter. Eventually, he says in his office to me, I know you're all worried about this. Like, you don't have to go all the way with him. You can do stuff with your hands and with your mouth. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Exactly. You're right. Like, it's still sex.
Still
like,
sex.
I don't want to do that. And I think my response then was like, dude, I haven't even had like the talk before. No one's given me the sex talk. Like, I am my sole educator on this. I'm not ready to just go do something like that. Like, I need time. And he took that as his opportunity and he closed the door. And I remember him saying, I see you like my own daughter. So I want to give you this talk, this sex talk. It was like a full 2 hours that he talked and he closed and locked the door. I remember feeling so I was dripping sweat and my body was frozen at the same time and just feeling very small. I don't know, this is supposed to be part of a sex talk, so I'm including exactly how this was mentioned to me. He explained how to massage the balls, the best position, how to practice oral on a banana, how to experiment with masturbation so I could tell guys where to touch me because that's what I should be doing.
So it was all geared towards his or a male partner's pleasure.
That's what he said to me. It's like that's where he starts talking about masturbation, is that you need to know your body so you can tell guys where to touch you and how to do this. And I was a huge no on that. That just did not interest me. And he's like, well, yeah, my wife didn't like that either. But you need to become an adult and understand your body, and that you have a long way to go, is the way he would say it. He talked about times he had with old girlfriends and with his wife. That made me uncomfortable because I was very close with his wife. And I'm like, does she really want me to know all these intimate things about her? He brought up whenever his wife complained about giving birth or having cramps, he always said, well, it balances out because, you guys can have multiple orgasms, but guys can't. So that's the way he taught me that, girls can have guys
I am
can't.
so sorry.
I know. I know. Okay. He was like, well, if guys can't stop and you don't want to be raped, you do oral. And then he finally wrapped it up by saying, don't tell. This is a private conversation. I could be fired for trying to help. I've done so much for you. And this is something no one else would ever do for you. I'm your only chance at being normal. You have to keep this between us. And he also brought up that it could affect my reputation. I'm having that conversation with the professor. So he put this pressure then of you better keep this quiet. Otherwise, this is going to be your fault. I do have to say, I remember I noticed right away, he was on my Instagram crazy. Right after that had happened, I would post something on my story. He was right there immediately each time. It's like he was afraid I was going to say something. He wrapped it up just by saying, I'm giving you the male perspective. You're lucky. Nobody else will get this because usually it's woman to woman giving the talk or man to man. I'm giving you the male perspective. I didn't feel right the whole rest of the day. I can't just ignore that this has happened. And I remember going to his office and I was like, can I talk to you? And he looked very panicked. He was like, yeah. And he closed the door and he gave me his full attention. And I'm like, well, you said if I had any questions I could ask you. Can I ask a couple questions? And he said, yeah. And so the stuff that he didn't cover, I'm like, what stuff about STIs? Isn't that a thing? And I explained, I'm like,
the most important stuff. Yeah.
And I'm like, I explained, I tried to look this up on Google and there's so much misleading and everything says the opposite. And I'm like, I just don't know. And so I asked him well, if I decide to do oral, do you need a condom for that? And he was like, no, it's not good for the guy if you have a condom. Don't, not that way.
Herpes isn't good for anyone. So
yeah, he asked how it was feeling about it. And I'm like, I feel very uncomfortable, just with your wife and stuff. And he's like, oh, she knows. She knows we had this talk. And I'm like, oh, she knows? And he's like, yeah, no, she was fine with it. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I started to feel crazy then. I'm like, well, if his wife is okay, then it's just me feeling weird because it's the sex talk and everybody feels weird during it, right? So I'm like, okay. He just gives me the reminder, don't tell, because the perception is not wrong. People just wouldn't understand us because I was different. I was behind and I was different. He's just trying to fix me. I can be, how society makes it seem, a normal person and into guys and everything will be fine. So this goes into the stuff about being gay that was really on top of my head. Then I'm like, well, God, he made me tell him all these secrets and he doesn't know. This, I hadn't told anybody, to be fair. I had kept that a huge secret. And I was like, well, he's the perfect one to tell because at this point, what do I care what he thinks? Because he already knows so many intimate things about me. And I told him, I'm like, I I just explained, I'm like, I think I'm gay. Like, I think I've been my whole life. And he's like, oh, I thought it was something really bad or something. And he's like, no, you're not gay. You just need a good experience with a guy. He starts like explaining straight attraction to like fix me. And he's like, well, I like the female body because it's something I don't have. And naturally we want what we don't have. So be excited about the male body because it's different. Here's an example.
To explain to a straight person what being straight feels like.
Mm-hmm. I get a text from the wife later. She knows. And she texted me and she just was like, like, it's okay if you are. I just hope that you're not. You need to go to therapy. Constantly, they were pressuring me to go to therapy, which eventually did happen.
But like conversion therapy. Yeah. That's
yeah.
Like, I'm sorry. I feel like I need to highlight, like, we're in conservatory in a very liberal city. So many music students are gay. I probably knew more queer people than straight people at all. So weird that he was masquerading, and I've heard other students say like, oh, he was trying to like relate to a non-binary student by saying, oh, this song could be about a man or a woman or a them, and like, so he was masquerading as being what is the norm in our culture. And that was probably one of the most shocking things, because unfortunately these stories don't shock me anymore. But finding out how homophobic he was behind closed doors in the midst of an environment where he's fostering so many young queer musicians really not that it disturbed me more than anything else. It all disturbed me, but that surprised me.
But then it starts leading into this pressure that he's putting on me to touch myself, constantly asking. And my excuses were like, okay, I tried, but it hurts. I don't like it. Or say, oh, I'm just on my period. That would just like increase his desire to fix it more though. And he's like, well, try clipping your nails. And there were times where he would like challenge me, like, I dare you, touch yourself in my office so like I can watch. Like, if you can do it in front of me, you won't be shy around a boy that you like. And I never did that, but he would always like pressure me to do it and be like, I doubt you would do it. You just would never do it, trying to show like you're not capable. I just like said no and like was convincing myself, well, he's just joking because he's saying it like he's joking. So must be joking. All of these talks about sexual things took a lot of time. And there were a couple times where they ran into our orchestra rehearsals. He faked many notes. Saying that we were doing theory homework instead. And that's why I was running late. And eventually he learned to be careful with that because they were starting to get suspicious. Even though he's pushing for all this stuff, eventually it leads into this like, okay, we have to stop this. Like, he became so paranoid and worried that people were going to find out. He'd swore to me, we're not having any more of these talks. The door is going to stay open. Like, that is that. And he asked if I was upset about it. And I'm like, no, I'm actually happy. Like, it's going to stop because this was making me uncomfortable. And he's like, well, like I knew it was making me uncomfortable. You freeze when you're in uncomfortable situations. Like, I knew that right away. And he just gave me a hug one last time, tugged at my bra, and I pushed him away. But it's like, oh, well, that was the last hug. Okay. I was so overwhelmed. And a lot of it was because of him, all the pressure he'd put on me, that I had self-harmed for the first time. I tried to see if it would give me like relief in some way, and it didn't. Yeah. And I just felt so guilty and so bad about it. And I went to him and I was like, look, I have to tell you something. I did something bad. Like, I'm just not sure how to like process this, how to feel about this. He was very upset. He threatened to report me unless I showed him the cuts. So he had me actually show him them, and he looked at them and he was mad. He's like, you know what? If you do it again, you're getting put on semester leave and no more church. And then he let me leave, and that was it. And I get a text from his wife later. This was the worst part. And I am still working on not believing this. Emotional abuse is strong. She told me she didn't want me at church anymore, but they were still going to let me go because I was a bad example to her kids and to all kids. I would traumatize kids by existing in that body that had been self-harmed. She could not trust me anymore because I had bad judgment. So I'm not a safe person for children. I can't be around kids. I could hurt them. I went to the professor right away and I'm like, oh my God, I'm like, your wife is saying this. And I trusted her. He was like, she's right. I agree with everything that she said. I just couldn't really voice it to you in my office. Like, how can I trust you're not going to hurt my kids? We can't leave you alone with them anymore. And I believed them. I wanted to stop going to church after that. I didn't want to see his wife after she said those things. I didn't want to be around their kids after she said those things. But the professor ended up saying that, no, you have to, you should. You don't have good judgment, and self-harm is a sin. So you have to go to church. And he ended up threatening to report me if I didn't go. So I kept going. I had to sit at the very end of the pew by the professor and his wife. I wasn't allowed to walk back with the kids. I had to walk behind them by myself on the way back. At the house, they made sure I was never near a kid by myself in case I decided to hurt someone. That messed me up. This ties into the rest of the senior guy thing. Then around this time, he asked to have tea at his place. I was so excited. I love tea. But I was also like, oh my God, he's asking me to go to his place. Like, this is so fun. Like, cool. Professor got so mad. He's like, no, you're not going. That's dangerous. I'm like, well, why is it dangerous? Like, no, he's asking me to hang out. And he didn't even want to talk to me when I wasn't agreeing with what he said. So once he stopped talking to me, I'm like, okay, well, it's my decision. I'm going to find like an in-between thing. And I'm like, I'm going to invite him over to my dorm instead. There, I'm finding the middle ground. Senior guy ended up having an addiction to pornography and sex. He actually wore like bracelets around his wrist that said it. And like he talked about it openly a lot. He said he talked about it in class a lot. Like everybody knew. The professor had to know.
Strange.
He had to have known with, and some things happened. I won't get into detail with that. But yeah, after he left, I was crying. Who could I go to? And I thought of my best friend, but I was worried of like what she would think of me. I didn't know how she would handle that. So I called the professor. He ended up calling me. I kind of explained like what had happened. The following day, he had me come to his office and he wanted me to talk about it like in detail. I, of course, broke down sobbing, and there he was to console and to save the day. But at the same time, he was also shaming me to not tell anyone else about it because it could hurt my reputation as the girl that, invites people over for sex, was what he was saying. And it could ultimately destroy my career. And I didn't want to have that. Yeah. So I was like, yeah, I'm not telling anyone. I'm like, okay. The senior guy, he actually texted me the day after because he wanted to come over again. And I was very firm. And I said, look, I don't want to do anything like that with you. Like, that's not happening again. And he never talked to me again. I mean, obviously, after something happens like that, you don't want to hang out with anyone like that anymore. But I also saw him as a really great friend. And I was so sad to see he never talked to me again because he wasn't interested in being my friend.
Yeah.
So that was hard. I'd lost somebody I thought that was very close to me. And I guess side note, I did tell my best friend afterwards, and she was supportive, but she was also like, why did you invite him to your room? That just like validated what the professor had said. I think he kind of used this as a good chance to continue his grooming. And this is where the beginning of the stories, is what he called it, happened. So his family had all gotten COVID. Because of it, he was sleeping on the couch. He couldn't sleep with his wife. I remember it was like 11 p.m. one night and I had already fallen asleep. And the text like jolted me awake. And I was like, what? And I looked and it was him. And he was asking like, how are you feeling? I'm like, just not feeling great, but I'm resting. And he's like, well, maybe I can practice like showing you what like a good normal experience is like, and I can write you like a story. You can imagine you being in the story and it being another guy, or maybe it being the same guy, but going well and being like consensual, respectful, like happy, loving sort of thing is like the terms that he would use. And I was like, no, like, I don't really want to do that. But he's like, well, you have to do it for me because I can't take this guilt. I can't sleep. I'm sitting here on the couch. Like, I introduced you guys. Like, I feel like it's my fault. This is the only time we can practice when I'm on the couch. You have to trust me. Like, I'm like, okay, fine. They were basically like his own sexual fantasies. And he would just send like sentences and individual texts. I was practically like falling asleep during it. Kind of look at the text and be like, this is weird, like whatever. And like, he's just weird. He kept saying, you should try to reach climax. And I'm like, no, I just can't. I can't right now. Like I tried, I can't. And he would get so flustered. And he's like, well, then it wasn't complete. It wasn't right.
Okay.
And the next day, this was one of the many times he took my phone in his office forcefully and deleted the texts. I wasn't really thinking I have to delete anything. I was just like, whatever. He'd even like said to me then, like, I think that you look and you talk a lot more confidently after the thing that happened with the senior guy, which is insane. So I want to further educate you in sex so you'd continue to adult more. That's what we've been working on, right? So the next couch night, he wanted to do another story. And I finally explained, I'm like, look, this right here is bothering me that your wife doesn't know. She knows about the talk you gave me. She knows about all of our other conversations, right? Does she know about this? And he's like, well, no, like, I don't know. I just didn't tell her. There's no reason to tell her. I feel like this is something she would understand. It's not wrong.
Okay.
Like, your perception on sex is screwed up. You need these stories to reprogram your brain.
And I'm the only one who can fix it.
Yes. He made me describe, like, tell me what these climaxes feel like, because I don't believe if you've done it or not. And when I was doing this, all of a sudden he's like, okay, like, I need to go now. It's late. I need to go to bed. And I didn't really understand he'd get so short all of a sudden like that with me and just like want to stop talking. Now I know.
Yes.
And he's clarified he was climaxing himself to my explanations. And I had zero, I could have never guessed that that's what he was doing. Because at the time it was like, it was for me. He kept saying that was work for him, that he was up at night writing stories. It's like, I'm doing this for you. This had been continuing though with the stories, and it was getting upsetting and frustrating. And he wasn't respecting in times that I didn't want to do it. I had finally been like, okay, I have to like tell the wife, because it's bothering me that the wife doesn't know. Maybe she would do something, or maybe she'd have advice on how to get him to stop, or maybe like she should know. Like, what if she's mad about this? I planned to have a phone call with the wife, asked if we could talk. Immediately getting on the phone with her, she starts talking to me about how she feels like I'm coming between her and her husband. We're constantly arguing about you. Like, I think you have feelings for my husband too. And so I did not get the chance to tell her over the phone. I go to the professor, of course, and after this had happened, I'm like, why didn't you tell me you guys were arguing about me? He just explains, he's like, well, it's not a big deal. I'm like, yeah, I mean, husband and wives, like, we argue. It's just because of how you look. You know, it's not to do with you. Like, you're blonde, you're thin, you're attractive. Those are things people are going to hate you for, and she feels threatened by you just because of how you look. That's all it is.
What a strange way to, yeah, that's such a strange way to phrase it.
So it's my features that are making her hate me. And I've now internalized this insecurity that he's given me. Now, whenever I'm going to church, I'm trying to like kind of cover that, or wear a little bit heavier clothes and just not look as nice and only put a little bit of makeup on. I always wear makeup if I go out, but I'm like, I just put a little bit because I don't want to overdo anything. Hoping that that would change the way that she saw me. I tried to tell her a second time, and I was like, maybe this is better to tell her in person. So my plans were to pull her aside when we were at church. And as we were walking back, we just happened to be isolated, just the two of us. And I'm like, perfect. I can like whisper this. The professor was like ways back behind me. And before I could say anything to her about it, because I was like a little hesitant, I was getting a little nervous, she brought up what happened with the senior guy. And she said, it sounds like you let that guy assault you for attention. It's more of like a cry for help. And that was it. That was it. My trust for her was gone. I can't tell her, because if I tell her what her husband is doing to me now, she's going to do the same thing. It sounds like you're letting him do this to you for attention. I don't want to be blamed for what her husband was doing too, and how that I had just been blamed for what happened with the senior guy. Whenever I tell one, inevitably gets to the other. So if I tell the wife, he's going to find out I told somebody. And what's that going to mean for me? After the wife had said that to me, I wanted to stop going to church, but he was able to keep me going with some of the threats. And he's like, I gotta go for the kids. Like, I have to go. You're
dangerous around kids, but you can't not go for them.
Do you see? And that's why it's hard to tell this story. He said that it was all his fault, everything he did to me. And then he said, well, you let me do all this stuff. It was your fault. You didn't do enough to stop me. Like, everything that happened, he contradicted himself.
You need to have these sexual experiences. Everyone's going to hate you for doing these things and letting a guy come up to you. How are you supposed to be able to make good judgment or think clearly when you have somebody literally employing brainwashing and gaslighting tactics to you constantly? You have no stability, and you have no chance to catch your breath from the emotional whiplash of all of this.
And as the stories are going along, finally, he claimed the guilt was getting him, or maybe it was the fear of people finding out. He just kept saying, I'm stupid. I'm so dumb. It's my fault. And seeing, like, I saw him as a father too. Seeing him get like that, I had to like console him. But I used that time to like beg to stop those conversations entirely. And I'm like, okay, you're right. This is too much. We need to stop this then. Let's just stop it. You know, I'm saying, let's stop it. Even though I was the one like, please don't do this. I'll never forget this comment saying, you're stronger than I am. There was a small break where he didn't write the stories anymore. And eventually he comes to me and is like, you know, I look at this website quite a bit called Literotica. And I think that this would be a good thing for you to read stories off of, because then I'm not writing them. Can I like send you a few links to certain stories I think you would like? And I'm like, isn't this the same thing? He's like, well, no, I'm not writing them. But then he was sending videos too from like porn websites. And a lot of the stories that he was sending to me from Literotica were people going for massages that turned into something else, mostly involved older men and younger women's first times. And you'd think that that would immediately be setting alarms off, and it did. And when I brought this to him, he was like, yeah, I know it sucks, not every story is perfect, but those just happen to have the best storylines and sex lines for you. He promises, I won't send you these stories anymore. There was a time where he was heading home from school and he was on the bus and I was back in my dorm, and saying that he wants to write a story. He's bored on the bus ride. And I'm like, we said we weren't doing this anymore. I really don't want to. And he kept pushing and pushing. I'm like, okay, fine. And after he finished it, he's like, okay, did you succeed? And did you finish? And he would claim that I was lying. It's like he caught up on it. He knew I was lying. He knew I didn't want to do it in the first place. So he knew that I was just trying to get him to stop. And he's like, I don't believe you. I want proof. Send me a video. And I'm like, no, I would never, ever do that to anybody, let alone you. I'm not doing that. He's like, okay, fine. I won't make you send a video. Send an audio. So he starts off asking for the big favor, right? And then he makes it smaller. Just send an audio recording then. So I don't have to see you. That's all. And I'll tell you how you sound. I'll tell you if you sound normal, if anything could be fixed. Oh, I know girls that like howl when they climax. It's like such a turn off. I gotta make sure you're not like that. But like girls that don't make any noise isn't good either. So I gotta make sure that, you sound good so you'll be good for your future boyfriend.
Where's he getting these standards from? Like porn. That's where he's getting these standards from. It's not real. Like these ideas of like the right kind of noises. Everybody's body is different. Everybody responds differently. So there isn't a right way to do that. Like he's regurgitating an acting performance as the only way for this to be authentic, which is stupid.
And he used this as like, well, it's also for me because I want to hear you be loud to my stories because it's my work that I've put into it. At this point, he had been asking for audios for weeks, using any kind of manipulative tactic that he could use. You're behind in your sex ed. Nobody else will do this for you. It's your only chance to learn. You can be a good girlfriend in the future. It gets in your head. Finally, I was like, get him to stop. What more can you do when I send an audio? And I'm like, I could never send a video. Like, that's not going to happen. So send the stupid audio. He'll see I did it. And then what? There's nothing else to do. It's done. And finally, I sent it. And I remember crying after I hit send and I threw my phone across my bed. I just like begged over and over again, like, I'm never doing that again, never doing that again. You know what his response was? I need to keep practicing because I wasn't loud enough. So I think that to me, I'm like, this is never going to end. Like nothing will ever be good enough for him. I asked in person, I'm like, can we please stop? You're making me uncomfortable. You know, I don't want to do any of these things. Then he switches off into the loving figure and he closes the door, gives me a hug and tells me like, I see you like a daughter. I could never hurt you. And so very end of my sophomore year, then the last little situation that happened being on campus, he was going to be teaching a Shostakovich class in the following semester, and he mentioned I might be able to sit in on it. And he'd had me borrow his books so many times. And I saw that he had this one green Shostakovich book out, and it looked really interesting. And I was like, oh, can I borrow that one? Like, I'm sure, like, I'll see you at church, like, this summer too, so I can give it back to you then. And he was like, no, I still need it, like, to work on for the class. I knew I'd be going back to his office later that day anyway. He went to go to the bathroom. I snuck it as a joke, like in my bag. And then I was getting ready to go to an exam afterwards. He texted me for something. And then I'd started like reading the book already and there was a certain like term in there. And I texted it as a joke. And I'm like, oh, I'm being like this using the term that was in the book. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, you didn't notice? And all of a sudden comes back, you took my book. And I was like laughing and I sent a picture of it on the table. And I'm like, I'm sorry, like, it was just a joke. Like I read like the first chapter. As soon as my exam's over, I'll come give it back to you. And he responds back and he's like, well, you took my book, so now you owe me a favor. I will never forget how sick I felt to my stomach. I knew something was off. Like I knew he wasn't just joking, being like, you owe me a favor now. Something felt wrong. I did not do well on that exam. I didn't fail the exam, but I couldn't stop thinking about it because what was going on in my head was like, is he really going to do something to me? Like he couldn't do something to me, but is he capable of that? Like, I don't know. And I knew that after I finished the exam, I'd be going to his office. And so during the exam, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go to his office. I'm aware that there's a risk. I'm going to see, would he really do something? Because if he would do something and hurt me and touch me, that would be it. I don't know what I would do, but I'd have to do something. He'd said over his text, like, yeah, you gotta do me a favor. And I'm like, yeah, like clean your office. And he's like, no, I'm thinking something more pleasurable. And in my head, obviously, it's what I'm thinking is from his stories. I'm like, oh my God, like, no way, no way. And I remember walking to his office then, and I was so afraid. And I had the book like clenched to my chest like this, because I'm like, this is it. He looks up at me, he's like, are you molesting my book? And I'm just like, no, like, ew, gross. And then he starts saying, all right, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do for me? And I'm like, clean your office. All of a sudden he got this like look on his face and he looked down and he's like, yeah, my wife says that too. Like, it's messy. Yeah. And he just got this kind of solemn look. And I'm thinking like it kind of clicked to him. Now I can see it. At the moment I didn't. He knew what he was about to do was wrong. But, at the time I was like, oh, okay. So he doesn't have bad intentions. He was just joking. And then the last section that we're going to talk about in this episode of grooming is the summer before my junior year. I had survived my sophomore year, the very intense sophomore year. Over the summer, the professor was texting me almost every day. We would talk about the Shostakovich class that he was teaching in the fall. Sometimes he'd FaceTime me, talking to me about church stuff, going to church still, and of course, still talking about sexual stuff. It even got to the point where he was sending me pictures of him like with his wine cup or beer out at like a festival or something, and just telling me like, try it, you have to try alcohol, you have to try it. And I had just turned 20 at that time. He knew I really wanted to get an apartment for the next school year, and he was pushing to get an apartment in his neighborhood. You're gonna have a family right here who loves you, we really love you, go to church with us, this could be really good for you. And he was showing me, helping me apartment search, like sending me apartments. But in order to do that, I needed to get a full-time job. I was managing a double degrees and working part-time, and he wanted me to find a full-time job. The jobs that he offered didn't work out. And the comment that I got back from that was that I was a privileged white girl and I was spoiled. His wife went crazy at me, comparing me to immigrants that she said she just saw begging on the streets for jobs, and I should accept anything that I'm offered. And the fact that I'm doing that is disrespect.
You were working in your field.
I was working. Yeah, that's the thing. It's not like I had no job. I was working. This is the funny thing. He wanted me to work a lot of hours so I could have enough money to live close to him. Mm-hmm. His wife wanted me working a lot of hours so I wouldn't be around them as often. Around this time, I did start to self-harm. It started up again. I didn't know at this time that the wife was secretly like begging the professor that I don't go to church with them anymore. Despite the craziness, I did like going to the mass. The masses were gorgeous. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone. And there was a time where we were heading back from church and they were talking about sushi. Asked me, she's like, "Oh, have you tried sushi before, Emily?" And I was like, I have, but I can't say like if I like it for sure or not, because when I did get it, they like dumped a bunch of soy sauce on it and I don't like soy sauce. So I just didn't like it. But the sushi, like I might like it without soy sauce. I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to you on that. And the wife was like, "Oh, you're lying." You're lying because they don't put soy sauce on sushi. So you're making it up. I'm like, I did have sushi that one time, right? And it was soy sauce, right? And like, yes, I did. I can guarantee you that I did. And she had completely like
the liar, the real liar in this situation is someone she can never get an admittance from or an apology from. So she is taking everything out on you because she knows that she can guilt trip you.
There's a time where then it was the birthday. I remember I spent $8 on a gift. The wife freaked out and she's like, "You're wasting your money." And so I offered, I'm like trying to make amends here and make peace. I'm like, "Would you like me to not bring the gift just to kind of keep the peace?" And he got mad at me then. He's like, "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Like you're so overly sensitive. Bring the gift." I'm just like feeling smaller and smaller and smaller because yes, the wife and I were like friends, but she's also like a mother figure in some ways too. And so having somebody in that position talking down on me was doing so much damage that I wasn't even aware of. Now we get into I think this was the biggest thing that had happened that summer. I was over there after church and the kids were like, "We want to go to the beach." Like, "Yeah, Emily could come with us too." And the professor was like, "Yeah." And he ended up taking it back. And he told me, "It's like, look, you definitely can't be there at the beach when my wife is there. She can't see you in a bathing suit." He asked if I was upset, and I'm like, "No, I get it. Like, I get it. Like, I have my own insecurities too. Like, I get that would probably be too much. It's fine." And he was like, "What are you talking about? You're blonde, you're gorgeous, you're thin, you're perfect. Like, what insecurities do you have?" And I'm like, "Dude, I'm not talking to you about my insecurities." And he's like, "No, just tell me." And I'm like, "Well," I'm like, I can't tell you about all of them because they're personal. But one is like, I had eye surgery when I was younger, so my eyes don't really look even." And he was like, "Oh, well, I never even noticed that before. What's the other one?" And I'm like, "It's personal. I'm not telling you." And he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And I'm like, my chest is uneven. Okay. And it's embarrassing. So that's an insecurity that I have that no one really sees. He's like, "Your breasts never looked uneven." And I'm like, "Well, you've never seen me? I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Like, send me a picture so I can see." And I'm like, "No." I'm like, "Are you nuts? Like, I'm not sending you a topless photo." And he's like, "Well, fine, send it with your swimsuit on. So that way you're covered, but I can still see if it's uneven or not. And I can tell you, it can help you alleviate this insecurity that I really don't think you should have because I think you're fine." From everything that I didn't know, there was one thing that I did know. And I was like, bikini picture, it wasn't a bikini, but a swimsuit, bikini pictures, those are for girlfriends and boyfriends. This was an obvious no. I knew like this is not right. but he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. He was like the day after, like he asked me what I'd done, and I happened to buy a new swimsuit, and he's like, let me see it. And I sent a picture of it on my bed, just laying there. And he's like, no, I want to see it on you. And I can compare your breasts because you say that they're uneven. And I'm still saying, no, no, no. And here he goes, this is good education for you, blah, blah, blah. And his anger starts increasing and increasing and increasing because he had a faculty meeting to go to like in just a few minutes. And he's like, this is taking forever. I thought you trusted me. You're starting to make me mad. Just send the picture. I felt like I was completely spiraling and he was making me feel crazy. And finally, I wanted it to stop. Couldn't think. And I was just like throwing it on quickly and trying to get the picture done. And I covered my hand here and I took the picture and I sent it and I was like, oh God, I collapsed into my bed. And I was like, there, I'm done. Like I did it. And all of a sudden I get another text and he's like, move your hand. And he starts getting more angry and angry and angry. And finally I'm just like, fine. And I sent it. And that's when I finally sent it. That's when I started to cry. Something is like, doesn't look uneven to me. Got to go to my meeting. And then just stop texting. Should mention that it's starting seeing a therapist. And immediately I went to my therapist and I was like, oh my God, this is my fault. I drafted him some message and I was like, this is bad. This is wrong. We need to do something about this. And he's like, do you want to talk over Zoom? So we set up a time for a Zoom meeting. And he's like, okay, well, you go first. You talk about what you want to talk about. And so I explained everything and how I felt. And his response is, well, I was just joking. Like, I didn't mean for you to send it. You actually sent it. Like, so that's your fault. And he said that I surprised him when I actually sent it and starts claiming, well, you must be attracted to me. Otherwise you wouldn't freak out over something like that. Okay. And which is crazy. So, and I remember going back to his texts and I was looking through them and I'm like, he was begging me like relentlessly to send a picture. I know when he's joking, that was not a joke. He's like, well, okay, like what boundaries do you want to set? And I was like, okay, take advantage of this. I'm like, no more stories, no more pictures, no more talking about that stuff ever again. The only things we can talk about are my family stuff and school stuff going forward. That is all. And he got pretty upset about it, saying I wasn't grateful for everything that he had done for me and that there wasn't really much of a reason for him to talk to me then. And so I ended up apologizing and we agreed to like minimize those conversations. And I was like, okay, good. Then I feel better about this going forward. And I think the thing that I mentioned to him eventually, I don't know if it was during that conversation or later on, was like, this is my boundary. Anything that your wife would be upset about, we don't do. If she's fine with the talk, okay, fine. I don't want to upset her. So we're getting close to the end of the summer. He started requesting like car videos. And he's like, oh, you know, it'd be really cool is like, you should do like a video driving topless and like send it to me. Or like, if you want a guy to like you, that'd be pretty cool. Of course, I pushed back against this, but he's like, no, this is good for you because it's illegal and you're too much of a good girl. Like, I want to see reckless Emily. I want to see confident, like powerful Emily. And he framed it as this really good thing that if I could do that, I could do anything.
Powerful equals reckless. Right. Those are the things. Of course.
Yeah. So he would ask for things like that. And I know Claire and I actually were just talking about that, like realizing like how dangerous it really was. So after church once over the summer, there was an outdoor bonfire with hot dogs and marshmallows and it was really cool. But it was that was helping me, who was only like a few years younger than me, but still very much so a minor. And, you know, all my hands and I go to pick up the ketchup bottle and go to like put the ketchup on my hot dog. It was one of those defective bottles, my luck. And the ketchup goes like shooting out. It lands on pants and like dress shoe. And I started laughing and I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm like, where are the napkins? And so we go over by the professor and I immediately say what happened and he could tell because we were laughing. And I remember the professor kind of like giving me this look. And the day after, the professor texts me and he's like, we have to talk about that. What's wrong? And he's like, do you like
okay.
Minor. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We're being so silly with him and it was kind of mean. You know, people are mean to each other when they like each other. Like, that was kind of mean. Like,
you know, when people are mean to each other because they like each other, he tells on himself at every opportunity. And so he's building everything that he does on top of a million bad assumptions about the way the world works to create a false narrative to manipulate you even further.
I was isolated into the professor's hands. And then the music theory podcast, that best friend I had also made at the start of our theory classes, she'd graduated and she was now living in another state, getting her PhD. And we had been doing the podcast together too. But then all of a sudden over the summer, she's like, I just want to take a break. I was like, oh, okay, like, sure. And I figured she's busy. And then all of a sudden she sends me a link to her new solo podcast. I tried to be very mature and I'm like, I wish you would have told me, like, I'm very happy for you, but I wish you would have told me that was why, because I was waiting for you this summer. And she apologized. She's like, no, you're right. I'm sorry. And then the day after, she's like, no, like, you were a horrible co-host to work with, blocked me and everything. So then I lost that friend. And then she also went to the professor and placed the blame on me. And the professor told me. He didn't tell me what he said back to her, though. And since then, I have kind of like talked with my former co-host again. He was actually encouraging her to not work with me anymore. He framed it as like, in a good way. He's like, she's an undergraduate student. You're getting your PhD. You don't want to work with her. And she's overly sensitive. It was probably she just got upset, blah, blah, blah. And I had no idea that these conversations were happening. I was ready to be abused, to be assaulted. Like, there's still more grooming that does happen the first semester of junior year, but I don't want this to be 5 million hours long. So I'm not getting into that. Grooming is quite literally preparing you for something like sexual assault. I was vulnerable. I was extremely broken down by him, insecure by insecurities that he gave to me. It wasn't like when people hear about like sexual assault, it's like, yeah, he's a stranger that just pulls you into a dark alley and assaults you and then runs away. Like, those are so rare, but they do happen, but they're so rare. A lot of sexual assault cases aren't that way. And that's where like nobody, the legal system, people like in daily life, like aren't aware of unless it happens to you. He did these acts of grooming, so he had a better chance at ignoring my body's boundaries and assaulting somebody who was already destroyed in secrecy. That is the foundation of where sexual assault can occur, through this brainwashing and through this preparation. But I think this gives a better idea of how more so the time it's the person that you know that can assault you.
Yes.
It's not always a stranger. And this is how that dynamic can occur. This is how it can occur in music school and conservatory by a professor. I know that there was an Instagram post that I made to try to bring awareness to this sort of thing, to a song that was called Eyes Don't Lie. Seeing the pictures when I wasn't speaking about it, and it was always in my eyes, like they were like dead. You could see my eyes were dead and it was a fake smile. And when I made that post and said pictures of me while I was secretly being assaulted by a professor, I didn't really expect it to blow up that much. And I was happy that it did, because that's what I want. I wanted to bring awareness. You get a lot of hate comments too. And a lot of people just saying, well, how did that even happen? How does it even happen with a professor? Like, I'm so confused. Okay. And I mean, yeah, I didn't post the whole story. I'm not posting the, like, it's an Instagram post to bring awareness to one tiny thing of a much bigger picture. So I'm hoping that this episode helps to bring awareness to what grooming looks like. All right. Thank you everyone for listening. I know this topic was very difficult, but it is a hugely important one for people to be aware of, especially in the music community. If you have any feedback, specifically respectful and kind feedback, like Claire gave the disclaimer at the beginning, you can reach us at dissonantdialogues@gmail.com, or you can leave us a voicemail at 872-216-9032. Also, if you'd like to be a guest, or if you would have topic ideas or any questions about our podcast, you can give us a follow on Instagram and on TikTok. We're Dissonant Dialogues on there. This is the conclusion of our season 1, but we do have plans for a season 2. Just stay tuned, and we hope that you've enjoyed season 1 and are looking forward to another season of Dissonant Dialogues.
Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Okay.
I'm gonna go lay down now.
Yeah. I got all my butterflies for you.
So that was something that he used. He was on, that doesn't make any sense. Sorry. Spin it around.
Okay.
And
all right. My charger just like yanked out of my laptop.
Freshmore, kill me. Okay, there's the blooper.
Regulate with tea. Love this part.
What we'll fix that in the editing. However we fix it. Not like I'm gonna guess your age, but we'll get into more about the whole gay thing. Other guys that are, some guys our age are like, well, they're getting better as we get older. But he was like, I like to be seen as masculine.
Sounds like a you problem, sir. Narcissistic behavior.
Oh, okay.
He's so weird. I don't know what else to say. He's such a freak. I hate this story.